So as Drup as Drup Like Clinical Trials, or short for DLCTs, I refer to here as the entire group of clinical trials that were actually inspired by the original Drup protocol that was published, that comes from the Netherlands and that was published. I think what is really, really interesting about these trials is that many different groups in different countries actually took the original protocol and were inspired by it, and then started setting up their own independent clinical trials around it. And I think it's quite fascinating that without any type of central control, people kind of stuck or copied the original design of it. And it's a bit like everyone respected the Bauplan, and now these trials share a common setup and a set of common endpoints, while at the same time having their own unique factors, which I think makes it really, really interesting as a phenomenon. Now, what I also observed is when speaking to this community is that most people in there think of it when talking about their specific version of a Drup Like clinical trial. They think of it as a clinical trial, and you will recognize this image. And this image is, depending on how you look at it, you see either a vase or you see two faces. And when I look at these Drup Like clinical trials, I don't just see a clinical trial. I see, from our perspective as patients, I see access to treatment. And that comes from the fact that the patient population in these clinical trials are patients who have been through all standard of care options and who have nothing left. And you will know that this is a patient population that is very, very close to my heart. And this is something that we all share across all cancers, because unfortunately, there will always be some of us who do not respond to available therapies and who will need extra options. So for me, these Drup Like clinical trials offer additional options for patients who have nothing else left. Now, it's, however, a bit more complicated than that. And I think that's where the fascination for me comes from, because depending on who you are in the stakeholder ecosystem, and we all know that healthcare is really complex. It's not just about a clinician and a patient. There are many, many parties who belong to healthcare as a system, and that goes over researchers, but also decision makers like our regulatory agencies or HTA bodies, people who produce anything that belongs to healthcare, from pharmaceuticals, but also diagnostics. So one can go quite far who belongs to this stakeholder ecosystem and who influences what happens in healthcare or in this interaction between a clinician and a patient in the end. So there are many parties involved in this, and that makes this system extremely complex. And we have seen that things are not going quite so well for us. And I think we have seen now also after COVID, we have seen the impact on cancer. So there is a need for change, and it's for change management as well. So I think this is an interesting part to think of this system from, like, with multiple hats on. So what do different parties think about it? What I think is interesting in this setting is actually that while everyone in this ecosystem looks at these clinical trials, Drup Like clinical trials, with a particular interest, what is shared between people is that there is this shared motivation to provide options for patients in need. And that's often personally motivated, but I mean, cancer is quite frequent. So there are many people who have a personal experience with cancer in their own family, but there's also, I think, a moral obligation that we have to do something for people who have nothing else left. So depending on who you are and you look at this clinical trial, and I go a little bit more in detail in there, people see different things when looking at them. So as I already said, most clinicians think of them as clinical trials. Patients, for me, from our perspective, it would be access. There's some interesting setups and details in there that makes that, from a payer perspective, these are novel way to paying for precision medicine. From cost effectiveness or HTA bodies, it is a way to generate evidence in a close to real world setting. You can also think from a policy perspective that these are actually helping you to introduce precision medicine into a country. And it is quite interesting how many different hats you have. And I think this is an important part to remember, is that every stakeholder has not just one interest, but multiple interests. And what we need in order to change anything is an overlap in interests. We will never agree everyone on everything, but what we need is an area of overlap. And I think that is exactly what you find here. So people agree that we need options for these patients, and then they have other interests. And that balancing that, I think, will be a big part in what's coming. Now, but this is kind of summarizing actually why I think that these Drup Like clinical trials are so fascinating. So if you look in the middle, I mean, these simple lines, these are supposed to represent a clinical national version of or a copy of a Drup trial. So these would be now different ones, and you could think that this is the original one, the original Drup trial, and then this could be the Norwegian one, which is called Impress, and then this could be the Danish one, which is called Protaget, or there are different ones. So there's now also one in Sweden, there's one in Finland, there is one in France, and there's one in Portugal. There's a new version in Ireland, and there's a UK one, and now I have surely forgotten someone, but there's a growing group of people who are having their own version of Drup Like clinical trial. And what I think is now quite interesting is that these trials, though inspired by the original Drup trial, established independently, now go together and start working together. And this is what just has happened. So the group has now successfully applied actually for 2 different EU projects. And the first one is PCM4U, and it's basically nearly the same group of people who has applied for another project called Primrose, which is going to start off on in July, and where the European Commission really just signed the grant agreement. So these groups, though now back together, and I think that's a really, really interesting part for us, because of their shared Bauplan, or the shared setup, that is now possible to suddenly work together again, while at the same time having independent elements going on. So in a way, it is a setup that, from an innovation perspective, it's parallel innovation, because you have a shared setting, you kind of can coordinate and collaborate when it is good for everyone, while at the same time you have an independent national system that allows to integrate into a national context. We all know that our healthcare system looks different, so one needs that flexibility to be really able to get patients onto a trial. So I think it's a very interesting type of concept, and innovation agencies are actually very interested in it for that setting. What is also nice is if you go from a parallel innovation perspective, so people can try different things in parallel. The moment someone comes up or finds something that is really working and useful, anyone else can easily adapt it, because everyone has this kind of same underlying core of it. So I think in terms of speed and scale, this is a very, very effective way of innovation if you go into innovation theory. So I think that's an exciting part in there. What is also interesting is that the Drup trial, the original one, has a pragmatic outcome-based risk-sharing agreement between the national healthcare system and the manufacturer of the treatments. And what this looks like is that pharma companies will provide drugs for free for the trial for the first 16 weeks, after which there will be an evaluation. And if the patient has a response, the healthcare system starts paying the cost for these treatments. So that is typical for an outcome-based risk-sharing agreement, so that the people agree on when you measure and what you measure, and that then the risk is shared between the 2 different parties. What is really interesting is that until now, so they differ, for those who are not familiar with risk-sharing agreements, they come in 2 major categories. One part are financial risk-sharing agreements, and that could be any type of discount or rebate or whatever you can think of. The other ones are outcome-based risk-sharing agreements that are dependent on, for example, a patient response, and then the company gets paid. If there's no response, there is no payment. You can also combine the 2, but it was kind of what was said was that in order to have an outcome-based risk-sharing agreement, you needed, for example, a registry, and the data capture was quite difficult and costly, and that therefore that was not something one could easily set up. Well, this setup is a proof that it is possible to have a pragmatic outcome-based, like a lightweight risk-sharing agreement. And that's why this is number 2. I think that's, for us, from a patient advocacy perspective, this is really, really interesting and relevant, because it proves it is possible. Also interesting is, and that's the blue arrow here between 2 and 3, is that how this trial is currently set up, that it is an escalating design. So they're increasingly larger group of patients, that if there's a response in a smaller group, further patients will be added to a cohort until a full cohort is formed. If that happens, that cohort, the data from that cohort then gets submitted to the national HTA body, that then evaluates whether then it goes a normal cost effectiveness analysis. As you remember, normally this is just the other way around. So we will have like a market authorization, but afterwards there will be an HTA assessment, after which there will be a payer assessing whether they will pay yes or no. Here we have an inversion of the relationship. So we have first a risk-sharing agreement between the manufacturer and the healthcare system, followed by an HTA assessment. I think that is really, really interesting and relevant for any of us involved in HTA, because HTA bodies so far have been struggling with methodology for precision medicine. And we can expect that a lot of these therapies will get stuck there. So I think that is a really interesting way, because it is something that it suffices every party's needs, and that happens through the inversion, the way how we grant access and gather evidence. So that is on the right side. On the left side, if you now go to 4, what is equally interesting is that because the entry part in this clinical trial is a molecular assessment, so patients who are resistant will get molecular profiling. And that is a part where one can obviously build on what we're currently having. At the moment, I think there is about one is able to find options for about a third of the patients. But that means for 2/3, we still have nothing. And we also know that this is just part of the truth, that if you just look at genetics, you just find a part of what's going on. So there is need for other more different diagnostics, for combinations of diagnostics. And this is a space where one can basically integrate it, because one has a system where one captures every patient by adding additional diagnostics. One can also build on it and build on top of that the development of novel diagnostics. A diagnostic doesn't drop from the sky, but it needs development. And often it starts with the exploration of biomarkers. But then you have to validate them. You will be aware that we have IVDR coming. So we have to think about how we can validate diagnostics very much as we think about drugs, that we also need validated before we use them. So I think this is a very interesting, because it has this setup of where patients undergo a common process where one can overlay this with diagnostic development on top. So interesting in that, and this is like going a little bit above. Now it's called EHDS prototype, because in order to do all of that, of course, you need to capture the data in order to see what's going on. So this is part of the second EU project that I mentioned, is called the Primrose, where a common data capture platform is part of the project. And in a way, if you think about it, this is actually a prototype for the European health data space of what it could look like. It's a prototype because this is still a clinical system, so the data capture is like in a clinical trial. It's not something in the real world. Probably would like to have to go, but it is still a prototype. The idea is to build a cohort that works between different countries, and the data has to be captured. So I think it is a really bottom-up approach where clinicians between different countries start working together in a way that provides access for patients who have very few options left. And to go even a bit earlier, this is where it says 5, is that of course biomarker research is very intimately linked with basic research. And what is really nice, if you think along the entire pathway, you're really stitching together elements from the basic research till a patient on a drug. And then you can think of it as an eternity loop. So you can go from like a clinical observation, you can go back, obviously provided you have biobanked appropriately. You can go back to the samples, you can conduct research, and then you can go back to the clinic. So that of course requires that the setup is connected and that the data capture is there. And that's what the 6 is, that the success in this entire setup is in the linkage of these different elements. So one piece of it alone is not sufficient. So it is really to have it all tied up, and have a successful linkage. So if you really take one step back, what this is a precision medicine implementation device, if you like. This is way more than a simple clinical trial, because this aligns multiple stakeholders around this shared interest of providing access for patients who have nothing else left. So this is a little bit halfway snarky comments on top why this is so interesting. So in the middle, it is a way for us to have access and equity, because some of the countries have set up, for example, Norway has a system in place that there is now a national molecular tumor board where every patient in the country can access this molecular tumor board. And this is not what we see in most countries. Most countries it's centers of excellence, you have very few hospitals where patients can access advanced molecular testing. So I think this, in terms of broad access and equity is attractive for us. It's also an interesting way of doing things. It is in a way it's pragmatic, it's resilient, it's distributed, so it's flexible. It allows to learn very fast. It has something very, very down to earth to it, which I personally very much like. There's also something that people start developing standards and shared protocols, and that is need based. So it's not sitting together an academic consideration. What could a protocol look like? It is something. What do we find that we can actually get to work in praxis? So there is a reality check in there, which ensures that is actually working and then used, and it's not just for the sake of having a standard, but is really to improve what is going on. What I also personally like is there's a strong educational component in the group, so that people, like, for example, invite each other, or people who are interested in setting one up. It's the others who have a trial already running often help them to get started. And in a way, that's the best of the academic tradition and something that I think we should support. What is equally interesting is that we're finding it's a way for HTAs to get access or have a way to develop new methodology, and we urgently need that. I also think that it is a fair deal. So what we need, if we really want to change this system, we need fair deals where every stakeholder gets what they need. And this is actually, if done properly, a fair deal between pharma, but also diagnostics companies and the system. And with that, it has a chance to last. We will nothing that favors or disfavors one side over proportionally has a chance to be sustainable in the long term. So one needs a deal where everyone kind of gets what they need. So I think it's also interesting more to the left side that it is an opportunity for smaller companies and biotechs to develop products or novel therapies and get them to the market faster. And of course, the speed in there is something that our patients need, because time is definitely something that we don't have. And as I already said on the very bottom, it is the linkage and the stitching together and the aligning elements that make the magic in there. So all of that, and that was a bit of a whistle stop tour through the entire setup. But I think from a patient advocacy perspective, for us, this is highly relevant. And it is not just a clinical trial. It is because of a systematic approach, and that it has a potential that in the future we hopefully can be sure that more and more patients have one more option at the end of it. And I'm very much looking forward to our discussion on Friday. It's something we haven't tried before. So I'm very excited about it and looking forward to seeing you soon. Bye.